Hello, I'm Jonathan Bowman-Perks, and welcome back to my favourite time of the week. And as part of the Inspiring Leadership series, I am delighted to have Renier Lemmens here. And Renier has had a very successful and varied career. He describes it in three parts. The first part was his formative years as a consultant in Arthur D. Little, doing his MBA in McKinsey as well, learning a lot from a whole variety of different organizations. Second stage was in senior management roles in financial services, in great firms like Barclays, in PayPal, and in GE. And finally, the plural phase of his life that he's in right now is he's on Fintech boards. He's often the chairman or an advisor and things like banks and as a professor in financial services. So a fascinating guy who I've really enjoyed conversing with. And I just want to share some of those experiences. So Renier, welcome. Good to have you on board.
Thanks, Jonathan. And it's amazing to be invited on a series for inspiring leadership. That in and of itself is great. Thank you.
A real pleasure. And while we're talking about inspiring leaders, who's inspired you? You mentioned one who's non-business and then some of the business owners.
Yeah, on the non-business side, a hero of mine is a physicist called Richard Feynman. He's long passed away. He invented something called quantum electrodynamics, won the Nobel Prize, but what inspired me in him is that the most complex concepts he could bring across in a very simple way with a lot of humor into it as well. And then he, outside his own zone, when he got onto the Space Shuttle Disaster Investigation Committee, he was the one who, through first principles problem solving and a certain curious tenacity, helped the committee arrive at the conclusion about that seal, etc., that went wrong. So his curiosity and his way of communicating has really inspired me and set it's a bar that I can only dream about.
Yeah, and then in business?
In business, really, I've had a lot of inspiring people that I had the privilege of working with in my consulting career. I give one example, Ashok Alexander, who later on went on to manage the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in India, and from a senior partner at McKinsey became occupied with the plight of prostitutes and sex workers in India, and had a huge personal impact there. And what inspired me in him was he didn't just talk about values, he lived the values of the firm. He was a true friend, a true mentor, also a very smart guy, but someone who took a personal interest in me and really helped me develop and pointed out a lot of my rough edges in that stage of my career and helped them file them down.
Great. And then on to the teams. You've worked with a lot of fascinating teams. Which team would you pick out as an example of really inspiring teamwork, and what were the qualities that you admired there?
I think the team that most inspired me was the team that I was part of at PayPal Europe. We were in different countries, about 7, 8 of us, and what made it inspiring that in a very informal and fun-loving atmosphere, we dealt with some very ambitious business problems, a lot of mutual honesty, intellectual honesty and rigor, and driving initiatives into the organization with a real sense of camaraderie. And part of what we did was say a little bit, look, we are in Europe, we're different from the big brother in the US, and here's how we go about things. But that created a camaraderie that I really cherished in that team.
Yeah, and if there was one quality more than anything that makes a team toxic, because you've probably been in toxic teams or you've been a chair trying to organize a rather dysfunctional team. If there's one thing that makes a team toxic that you have to root out, what would that be in your experience?
In my experience, it's excessive politics. And what are politics? It means that I say something else about Jonathan when he's in the room than when he's not in the room.
Yeah.
And we all do that. We're all human. We do that to a certain extent. But when that starts taking a life of its own and begins dominating the culture, the team culture becomes toxic very quickly.
Yeah, thank you. And then all the inspiring leaders that I've ever worked with, the men and women, they're all good enough to admit that they make mistakes, quite a lot of mistakes. And those that think they don't, that they're not inspiring, they're just deluded. So if you think of a story of when you got something badly wrong through arrogance or just not reading it, what was the story that you got wrong? And what have you learned from that that's made you a better leader since, Renier?
So I was with another great friend of mine, Kito, the Boer at McKinsey, doing a engagement for a client in India. And Kito was a senior partner, and I wasn't a partner yet. And I thought I knew it all. I thought that his thinking about the engagement was not in line with values. It was all too commercial, and I've made a big rah-rah about it. And in retrospect, I'm so embarrassed of my behavior there. Such arrogance and presumption that I knew it all. And while that certainly didn't change me overnight, I'd like to think that that slowly began to inculcate a sense of humility and a preparedness to listen to others, which frankly, I was so busy proving myself that I didn't listen to anyone. I'm still proving myself, I think, at the age of 55, but at least I'm listening to people today.
Yeah, and let's stay with this one because it is such an interesting one. Before we go into your final top tip, that you and I were talking about the fact that in many of the organizations we're in, whether it be some of the great firms you've worked for or premier consulting firms like McKinsey and others, or even some of the generals and the leaders I've been with, that we're often over anxious overachievers. And I confess I'm one as well. What do you think is the problem when people are over anxious overachievers? What's your experience?
Well, from personal experience, and it takes one to know one, and I'm definitely an insecure, over anxious overachiever. Is that no matter what you do, it's never good enough. You don't smell the roses. You're always worried about the next thing, always comparing to someone else who's done this thing even better or even faster or in a more beautiful way, and it creates a permanent sense of unrest and discontent with self and often with others. So it's on one hand, it's a lifelong condition, and once you recognize it, becomes easier to manage, but perhaps it never quite leaves you.
Yeah, no, very insightful. And we were saying that the opposite is the sort of the under-anxious underachiever, the sort of one who's just happy to puddle along. And they probably have maybe an easier life. They don't get to the top of organizations, but I've found that unless people have a sort of come to Jesus moment or a Damascene experience where they go, hey, I'm just going to chill a bit now and just be really interested in people, then they're always going to be chasing the unachievable. And finally, top tip. If you were to give a top tip, practical thing to people to be a more inspiring leader themselves, that the people who are listening to this podcast and to this video, what would you give as your top tip to be a better inspiring leader?
Share about yourself in an appropriately frank way. Mm-hmm. Talk about one's own trials and tribulations in life creates a common humanity that, in the right setting, creates a stronger bond between people that need to work together.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Well, Renier, thank you. It's been great having you on the series, and we'll have a further Inspiring Leadership Extra session, but just for this bit that we can share with people, I really appreciate you bringing your wisdom and experience, and keep advising and enjoy your plural career. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks, Jonathan.